Emma walked slowly through her grandmother's small cottage, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting gentle shadows on the wooden floors. 3 months had passed since her grandmother, Mary, died peacefully in her sleep, and now Emma faced the difficult task of sorting through a lifetime of belongings. The cottage felt so quiet without Mary's warm presence. Emma remembered how her grandmother would hum old songs while making tea, or how she would sit by the window reading her books with a soft smile on her face. Now the silence felt heavy, filled with memories that seemed to whisper from every corner of the house. Emma climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, pushing open the creaky wooden door. Dust particles danced like tiny stars in the golden sunlight that filtered through the small window. Cardboard boxes were stacked everywhere, each one holding pieces of her grandmother's long life. Emma had been putting off this task for weeks, knowing it would be emotional and difficult. She started with a box labeled old papers in her grandmother's neat handwriting. Inside were school certificates, old bills, and faded receipts from decades past. Emma smiled as she found her grandmother's teaching certificate from 1945. Mary had been a primary school teacher for 40 years, touching the lives of hundreds of children in the village of Millbrook. In the corner of the attic sat an old wooden chest with brass corners that had turned green with age. Emma had never seen it before. The chest was locked, but the key hung from a small nail on the side. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the key and lifted the heavy lid. The chest smelled of lavender and old paper. Inside, Emma found carefully folded clothes from long ago, including a beautiful blue dress that must have been her grandmother's Sunday best. Beneath the clothes lay a leather journal, dark brown and worn smooth by many hands. A faded pink ribbon held it closed. Emma lifted the journal carefully, feeling its weight in her hands. As she untied the ribbon, the journal opened slightly, and a black and white photograph slipped out like a falling leaf. It fluttered to the dusty attic floor. Emma bent down and picked up the photograph. What she saw made her gasp softly and sit down hard on an old wooden crate. The picture showed two young women, probably in their early 20s, standing close together with their arms linked. They were smiling at the camera, their faces bright with happiness and youth. One of the women looked exactly like her grandmother Mary, but younger than Emma had ever seen her. Mary's dark hair was styled in soft waves, and she wore a pretty, floral dress. She was laughing at something, her eyes crinkled with joy. Emma had never seen her grandmother look so carefree and happy. But something was terribly wrong with the photograph. The right side had been torn away in a jagged line, leaving rough edges where someone else had once stood. Emma could see part of another person's shoulder and arm, but the rest had been ripped away completely. Emma turned the photograph over with shaking hands. In her grandmother's familiar handwriting, written in fading blue ink, were the words, "Rose and me. Summer 1943. Rose." Emma had never heard her grandmother mention anyone named Rose. Throughout Emma's childhood, Mary had always seemed like a woman without close friends. She was kind to everyone in the village, but she kept to herself mostly. When Emma had asked about friends from the old days, Mary would just smile sadly and say she had been too busy working to make lasting friendships. Emma stared at the photograph, trying to understand what she was seeing. Her grandmother looked so happy in the picture, so alive and full of joy. The woman next to her, Rose, was pretty with light-colored hair and a warm smile. They looked like the best of friends, like sisters almost. Who was the person who had been torn out of the photograph? Emma could see it had been done deliberately, not accidentally. Someone had taken scissors or just ripped the picture with their hands, removing a third person from this happy moment in 19 for a 3. Emma held the photograph up to the afternoon light streaming through the attic window. The jagged tear seemed to tell a story of pain and anger. Who had been important enough to be in this picture with her grandmother and Rose? And what had happened to make someone tear that person away? Her heart ached as she imagined her. Grandmother, perhaps sitting alone in this very cottage, making the difficult decision to rip someone out of her life. But why had she kept the photograph at all? If the memory was too painful, why not throw it away completely? Emma looked round the quiet attic, suddenly feeling the weight of all the secrets hidden in this old house. Her grandmother had lived for 92 years, but Emma realized she knew very little about Mary's young life. The war years, the 1940s, seemed like a mystery now. The photograph raised so many questions. Who was Rose, and where was she now? What had happened between these three friends that was so terrible it required tearing up their picture? Emma felt both sadness and burning curiosity filling her chest. She carefully placed the torn photograph back inside the leather journal and tied the ribbon. This mystery had waited almost 80 years to be solved. Emma knew she could not rest until she learned the truth about Rose and the missing person in the picture. Emma woke up early the next morning with the torn photograph on her bedside table. She had barely slept, thinking about her grandmother's secret past. After breakfast, she decided to start asking questions round the village. She put the photograph carefully in her purse and walked into the centre of Millbrook. The village was small and peaceful, with old stone houses lining the narrow streets. Emma had visited her grandmother here many times over the years, but she had never really talked to the other residents. Now she wished she had paid more attention to the stories the older people might have shared. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Margaret Collins had worked for 30 years. Margaret was about 70 years old and knew everyone in the village. When Emma showed her the photograph, Margaret put on her reading glasses and studied it carefully. "I'm sorry, dear," Margaret said kindly. "I moved to Millbrook in 1960, so this would be before my time. But you should talk to some of the people who grew up here during the war. They might remember your grandmother when she was young." Emma thanked Margaret and continued walking through the village. She stopped at the small grocery store, where the owner, Mr. David Harris, was stocking shelves. David was in his late 60s and had taken over the store from his father. "My dad used to tell stories about the war years," David said, looking at the photograph. "But I don't recognize these faces. You know who you should ask. Mrs. Patricia Wilson at the tea shop. She's lived here all her life, and her mother used to run a shop during the war too." Emma's heart lifted with hope. She walked quickly to the village tea shop, a cozy place with small round tables and lace curtains in the windows. The smell of fresh scones and tea filled the air. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver hair tied back in a neat bun. "Mrs. Wilson," Emma asked politely. "I'm Emma Johnson, Mary Johnson's granddaughter. I was wondering if you might help me with something." Patricia Wilson's face brightened immediately. "Oh, Mary's granddaughter. Your grandmother was such a lovely woman. I was so sorry to hear when she passed away. She used to come in here every Tuesday for a tea and a scone. What can I help you with, dear?" Emma carefully took out the torn photograph and placed it on the counter. Patricia adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to look at it. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Oh, my goodness," Patricia whispered, her voice filled with surprise. "That's the old Bell's Tea House. I haven't seen a picture of it in years." "Bell's Tea House?" Emma asked eagerly. "Yes, it used to stand where the bank is now. It closed down in 1950. But during the war years, it was the most popular place in the village." Patricia picked up the photograph and studied it more carefully. All the factory girls used to meet there after work. They would sit round the tables, drinking tea and talking about their day. Emma felt her pulse quicken. Factory girls. Your grandmother Mary worked at the aircraft factory on the edge of town, Patricia explained. During the war, they converted the old furniture factory to make parts for airplanes. Dozens of young women worked there, doing jobs that men usually did before they went off to fight overseas. They were so brave. Those girls, hard work it was too. Patricia looked more closely at the two women in the photograph. I was just a child then, but I remember seeing groups of these young women walking through the village after their shifts ended. They would laugh and chat together. Some of them became very close friends. Do you remember my grandmother having any special friends? Emma asked hopefully. Patricia thought for a moment. You know, I think I do remember your grandmother. She was always so kind to children. But for more details about those days, you should talk to Mr. Thomas Baker. He runs the local history group, and he's got the best memory in the village for old stories. Patricia gave Emma directions to Thomas Baker's house, which was just a few streets away. Emma thanked her and hurried through the village, feeling more hopeful than she had in days. Thomas Baker lived in a cottage covered with climbing roses. He was working in his front garden when Emma arrived, and she could see that despite his age, he moved with energy and purpose. His hair was completely white, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. Mr. Baker, Emma called out politely. I'm Emma Johnson, Mary Johnson's granddaughter. Mrs. Wilson said you might be able to help me with something about the war years. Thomas straightened up and smiled warmly. Mary's granddaughter. Of course. Come in. Come in. Your grandmother was a wonderful woman. I've got some tea on if you'd like some. They sat in Thomas's cozy living room, which was filled with old books and photographs of the village from decades past. Emma showed him the torn photograph, and Thomas put on his reading glasses to examine it carefully. His weathered face grew serious as he studied the picture. I remember your grandmother well, Thomas said slowly, his voice thoughtful. Sweet Mary was always with her best friend Rose Bennett. They were like sisters, those two. You rarely saw one without the other. Always laughing, always together, sharing secrets like young women do. Emma's heart began to race with excitement. Finally, someone who remembered Rose. But then Thomas paused, and his expression became troubled. But something happened between them near the end of the war. I never knew exactly what it was. Nobody talked about it much in those days. People kept their private business to themselves. But I remember they stopped being friends very suddenly. One day they were inseparable, and the next day they wouldn't even look at each other. Do you know what happened to Rose? Emma asked urgently. Is she still alive? Thomas shook his head sadly. Rose moved away from Millbrook right after the war ended in 1945. Just packed up and left. Nobody heard from her again after that. Your grandmother never spoke about it, but you could see the sadness in her eyes whenever someone mentioned Rose's name in conversation. It was like a shadow would pass over her face. Emma left Thomas's house feeling both excited and frustrated. She had learned Rose's last name was Bennett, and that something terrible had happened between the two friends. But she still had no idea what had caused their friendship to end so suddenly, or who the third person in the photograph had been. Walking back to her grandmother's cottage, Emma felt determined to solve this mystery that had clearly caused her grandmother so much pain for so many years. The next morning, Emma walked to the Millbrook Public Library with a notebook and pen in her bag. The library was a small brick building that had served the village for over 100 years inside. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Susan Clark, greeted Emma with a warm smile. I'm looking for information about the aircraft factory during World War II. Emma explained. My grandmother Mary Johnson worked there, and I'm trying to learn more about that time. Mrs. Clark's eyes lit up with interest. Oh, what a wonderful project. We have a whole section about local war history. Let me show you where to start. Emma spent the entire morning reading through old newspapers that had been carefully preserved. The pages were yellow and fragile, but the stories came alive as she read them. She learned that the Millbrook Aircraft Factory had employed over 200 women during the war, working in shifts round the clock to build parts for Royal Air Force planes. In a newspaper from July 1943, Emma found what she was looking for. There was a large photograph showing dozens of women in work clothes standing in front of the factory. The headline read, "Local women join the war effort." Emma studied each face carefully until she found her grandmother. There was Mary, looking so young and proud, wearing overalls and with her hair tied back in a headscarf. Standing right next to her was a pretty woman with dark curls and bright eyes. Emma's heart jumped as she read the caption below the photograph. Local girls doing their part for the war effort. Mary Johnson and Rose Bennett lead production team. Emma stared at the newspaper picture for a long time. Her grandmother and Rose looked so happy and confident, like they could handle anything the world threw at them. They were clearly best friends, standing close together with easy smiles on their faces. Emma made copies of old newspaper articles and continued reading. She found stories about factory workers organizing fundraisers for soldiers overseas, and articles about women taking on jobs that men had done before the war. But she could not find any more information about what had happened between Mary and Rose when Emma returned to the tea shop that afternoon. Mrs. Patricia Wilson was cleaning tables after the lunch crowd had left. Emma showed her the newspaper, photograph, and Patricia studied it carefully. You know, Patricia said thoughtfully, my Aunt Helen worked at that factory too. She's 94 years old now and lives in the next village. She might remember your grandmother and Rose. Would you like her phone number? Emma's heart leaped with hope. Yes, please. That would be wonderful. Patricia wrote down Helen's phone number on a piece of paper. She's still very sharp for her age. Her hearing isn't perfect, so speak clearly. But her memory is excellent. That evening, Emma sat in her grandmother's cottage and dialed Helen's number. The phone rang several times before a shaky but clear voice answered. Hello. Hello. Is this Helen Davies? My name is Emma Johnson. Patricia Wilson gave me your number. I'm Mary Johnson's granddaughter, and I was hoping you might remember her from when you worked at the aircraft factory during the war. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mary Johnson, Helen repeated slowly. Oh yes, I remember Mary very well. Such a sweet girl she was, always helping the newer workers learn their jobs. Why are you asking about her, dear? Emma explained about finding the torn photograph and her search to understand her grandmother's past. When she mentioned Rose Bennett, Helen's voice grew very quiet. Oh dear, Helen said softly. Rose Bennett. That's a story I hoped would stay buried after all these years, please. Emma said gently, I just want to understand what happened. My grandmother never talked about those days. Helen was quiet for so long that Emma worried the call had been disconnected. Finally, the old woman spoke again, her voice filled with sadness. Your grandmother Mary and Rose were the best of friends, inseparable. They worked side by side every day, and after work they would go to Bell's tea house together. Everyone called them the twins because they did everything together. Emma held her breath, waiting for Helen to continue. But then James Miller came home on leave. Helen continued. He was a handsome young soldier, about 22 years old. He had grown up in the village but joined the army right after the war started. When he came home for 2 weeks before shipping out to France, all the girls noticed him. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She sensed she was about to learn something that would break her heart. Both Mary and Rose fell in love with James, Helen whispered. He was charming and kind, and he spent time with both of them. But James chose Mary. He proposed to her the night before he was supposed to leave for France. Emma closed her eyes, imagining how Rose must have felt. Rose felt betrayed. Helen continued sadly. She thought Mary had deliberately tried to win James's heart. Knowing how Rose felt about him, Rose believed that Mary had been competing with her instead of being a true friend. They had a terrible fight that night at Rose's boarding house. Rose said some cruel things she probably didn't mean. She accused Mary of being selfish and dishonest. "What did my grandmother do?" Emma asked quietly. Mary was so hurt by Rose's accusations that she ended their friendship right there. She took off the friendship bracelet Rose had given her and threw it on the floor. Then she walked out and never spoke to Rose again. Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. What happened to James? Helen's voice became even quieter. He was killed in France 3 months later. A bomb hit his unit during a battle. Both girls lost him, but they were too proud and hurt to comfort each other. It was the saddest thing I ever saw. They had both lost their best friend and the man they loved. But they suffered alone. Emma understood everything now. The third person in the photograph had been James Miller. Her grandmother had torn him out of the picture because the pain of losing both her fiancé and her dearest friend had been too much to bear. But she had kept the photograph because some memories, even painful ones, were too precious to throw away completely. Emma could not sleep that night after talking to Helen. She kept thinking about Rose Bennett and the terrible fight that had destroyed two best friends. The story made her heart ache. Knowing how much pain both women had carried for so many years, the next morning, Emma sat at her grandmother's old wooden desk with her laptop computer. She decided to try to find out what had happened to Rose after she left Melbrook in 1945. Emma had never done this kind of research before, but she was determined to learn everything she could. She started by searching for Rose Bennett in online records from the 1940s. There were many women with that name, so Emma had to look through dozens of results. She felt frustrated after the first few hours, but she refused to give up. On the third day of searching, Emma found something that made her heart race. There was a marriage record from 1946 in Liverpool. Rose Bennett had married a man named William Carter on June 15, 1946. Emma stared at the computer screen, hardly believing she had found a real clue. She continued searching for Rose Carter and found more records. Rose and William had moved to Wales sometime in the late 1940s. Emma found birth records showing that Rose had 3 children, a daughter named Linda born in 1947, a son named Peter born in 1950, and another daughter named Susan born in 1953. Emma spent the next 2 weeks searching through more recent records. She found William Carter's death certificate from 1998, showing that Rose had been widowed for many years, but was Rose still alive? Emma searched through current records and care home listings in Wales. Her hands were shaking when she found what she was looking for. Rose Carter, age 97, was listed as a resident at Sunset Manor Care Home in Cardiff, Wales. Emma stared at the address on her computer screen, hardly believing that her grandmother's lost friend might still be alive. Emma picked up the phone and dialed the care home's number. Her heart pounded as she waited for someone to answer. Sunset Manor. This is Jeanne speaking. How can I help you? Hello, Emma said nervously. I'm calling about one of your residents, Rose Carter. I'm trying to find out if she might be willing to see a visitor. Are you a family member? John asked politely. Emma explained the whole situation about her grandmother Mary and the torn photograph. John listened carefully and then said, "That's quite a story. Let me speak to Rose's daughter Linda. She visits every week and makes decisions about Rose's visitors. Can you call back tomorrow?" Emma barely slept that night. The next day, she called the care home again. This time, Jonna connected her directly to Linda Carter, Rose's daughter. "This is very surprising," Linda said when Emma explained everything. "My mother has never talked much about her life before she married my father. But I do remember her mentioning a friend named Mary from her factory days. She always seemed sad when that name came up." Linda agreed to let Emma visit, but she warned that Rose's memory was not always clear, and she tired easily. Emma drove 3 hours to Cardiff the next day. Her hands trembled as she parked outside Sunset Manor Care Home. It was a pleasant building with a garden in front, but Emma felt nervous about meeting Rose after all these years inside. Linda Carter was waiting for her. Linda was a kind-looking woman in her 70s with grey hair and warm brown eyes. "You look a bit like your grandmother," Linda said, studying Emma's face. "My mother is having a good day today. Her mind is clear, and she's sitting by the window in the sunroom. Are you ready?" Emma followed Linda down a hallway decorated with paintings of flowers. They entered a bright room filled with comfortable chairs and large windows overlooking the garden. In a chair by the window sat an elderly woman with white hair pulled back in a soft bun. Even though Rose was now 97 years old, Emma could immediately see the pretty young woman from the factory photographs. Rose's blue eyes were still bright and intelligent, though her face was lined with wrinkles and her movements were slow and careful. "Mom," Linda said gently, "this is Emma Johnson. She's Mary Johnson's granddaughter, from Millbrook." Rose looked up at Emma with surprise and wonder. "You're Mary's granddaughter?" she asked softly, her voice shaking with emotion. Emma nodded and sat down in the chair next to Rose. "Yes, Mrs. Carter. My grandmother Mary passed away a few months ago, and I found something that belonged to both of you." Emma carefully took the torn photograph out of her purse and placed it in Rose's trembling hands. Rose stared at the picture for a long moment. Then her eyes filled with tears. She touched the jagged torn edge with one finger. "I never stopped regretting that terrible night," Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. "I was so young and so foolish. I let jealousy destroy the most precious friendship I ever had." Rose looked up at Emma with eyes full of pain and regret. "I wrote letters to Mary for years, dozens of them, but I was too ashamed to send them. I was too proud to admit I had been wrong." She paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Is Mary? Is she still with us?" Emma gently explained that her grandmother had died peacefully in her sleep. Rose cried then, deep sobs that seemed to come from decades of buried grief and regret. After a few minutes, Rose called to her daughter Linda, "Bring me the wooden box from my dresser drawer," she said quietly. Linda returned with a small wooden box that looked very old. Rose opened it with shaking hands and reached inside. Emma gasped when she saw what Rose pulled out. It was the other half of the torn photograph. Emma stared at the other half of the photograph in Rose's wrinkled hands. Her heart pounded as she realized what this meant. Very carefully, she took her half of the torn picture from her purse and placed it next to Rose's half on the small table between their chairs. With trembling fingers, Emma moved the two pieces together. The jagged edges matched perfectly. For the first time in nearly 8 years, the complete photograph was whole again. There they were, 3 young people full of hope and dreams. Mary stood in the middle, her arm round Rose's shoulders. Rose was laughing at something. her dark curls catching the sunlight. And there was James Miller, tall and handsome in his army uniform, standing close to Mary with his arm round her waist. All three looked so happy and alive. With no idea of the heartbreak that was coming, James, Rose whispered, touching his face in the photograph. He was such a good man, kind and funny and brave. Emma looked at the young soldier who had caused so much pain without meaning to. He looked like someone who would have been a wonderful husband to her grandmother, and a good friend to Rose if things had been different. Rose wiped tears from her eyes and began to speak. "Your grandmother Mary was the best person I ever knew," she said softly. "She had the silliest sense of humor. She could make anyone laugh, even on the hardest days at the factory." Emma leaned forward, eager to hear these stories about her grandmother that no one else could tell. Mary was always helping the new girls who started work at the factory. Rose continued. Some of them were so scared and homesick. Mary would take them under her wing and teach them everything they needed to know. She never got impatient, even when they made mistakes. Rose smiled through her tears, and Mary was so generous. If someone forgot their lunch, Mary would share hers without question. I remember one winter when a girl named Alice couldn't afford warm gloves. Mary quietly bought her a pair and left them on Alice's workstation. She never told anyone she had done it. Emma felt her eyes filling with tears as Rose painted a picture of her grandmother as a vibrant young woman full of life and kindness. This was so different from the quiet, sometimes sad woman Emma had known. "Your grandmother was the most loyal friend anyone could ask for," Rose said, reaching over to hold Emma's hand. "She didn't steal James from me. I understand that now. Love just happens, and James chose her. I was too hurt and too proud to see the truth back then." Rose's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Mary never tried to compete with me for James's attention. She was just being herself, kind and funny and beautiful. James fell in love with who she was. I was so jealous and angry that I convinced myself Mary had betrayed me. But she hadn't. She was just a young woman in love." Rose opened her wooden box again and pulled out a thick bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellow with age, and Emma could see her grandmother's name written on the envelopes in Rose's careful handwriting. "These are letters I wrote to Mary over the years," Rose explained. "I wrote the first one just 6 months after I left Millbrook. I wanted to apologize and tell her how sorry I was for the terrible things I said that night." Rose untied the ribbon and showed Emma some of the letters. "I wrote to her every year on her birthday. April 15th, I told her about my children, about William, about my life in Wales. I shared memories of our friendship and told her how much I missed her." "Why didn't you send them?" Emma asked gently. "Pride," Rose said sadly, "and shame." As the years went by, it seemed harder and harder to reach out. I convinced myself that Mary had probably forgotten me and moved on with her life. I was too afraid that she wouldn't want to hear from me. Emma spent the rest of the afternoon with Rose, sharing stories about her grandmother's later years. She told Rose about Mary's quiet life in Millbrook, how she had never married after James died. She described Mary's beautiful flower garden behind the cottage, and how Mary spent hours reading books by the window. She always seemed to carry a gentle sadness. Emma said, "Now I understand why. She missed you too, Rose. I think she was waiting all these years for you to come back." When it was time to leave, Emma made Rose a promise. "I'm going to have this photograph professionally restored and framed," she said. "I'll bring you a copy so you can keep it here with you." Emma also promised to bring Rose copies of her grandmother's journal, which contained many happy memories of their friendship during the factory days. Most importantly, Emma promised to visit Rose regularly. "I live just 3 hours away," she said. "I can come see you every few weeks. We can share stories about Mary and keep her memory alive together." Rose hugged Emma tightly before she left. "Thank you for finding me," Rose whispered. "Thank you for bringing Mary back to me, even though she's gone." As Emma drove home to Millbrook that evening, she thought about everything that had happened. The photograph had been torn for decades, representing years of pain and regret. But the love between two friends had never really died. It had just been waiting for someone to put the pieces back together. Back at her grandmother's cottage, Emma placed the complete photograph on the mantelpiece where she could see it every day. Mary, Rose, and James were young and happy again, their friendship captured forever in that moment of joy. Emma understood now that some bonds are stronger than time, pride, or even death. It's never too late for forgiveness and love to find their way home. The end.